The skyrocketing cost of living.
If you're going to be staying in Prague, it's not cheap.
Prague can feel pretty expensive, especially when it comes to rent, food, and buying property.
Czechia is worse than you think. Just 10 years ago, a standard two-bedroom apartment in Prague cost you around 4 million crowns, which is about 154,000 euros. Today, that very same apartment costs you €500,000. And that's not even an outlier. To buy an average apartment in Prague today, you would need to save your entire gross salary, so that means every single penny for 15 years. And that's not just expensive, that's nearly worse than Amsterdam, worse than Athens, and the worst housing affordability of any major city in Europe today. But here's what makes Czechia's situation uniquely painful. The apartment prices now match Berlin or Vienna. Yet, Czech salaries remain roughly half of German and Austrian levels. The minimum net income of a household required to even qualify for a mortgage is nearly 4,000 euros net a month. And yet, the average net salary per month in January 26 is around 1,600 euros. Let that sink in. There's a housing crisis, a cost of living crisis, and now even a demographic crisis. This is a dramatic change from the Czechia the world once admired. What has happened? This is how living in Czechia became impossible. I'm Jan, and this is Prague Pulse. Czechia was once the poster child of post-communist transformation. After the fall of communism in 1989, the country rebuilt itself with remarkable speed. It joined the OECD in 1995. It was actually the first former Eastern Bloc country to do so. It became a manufacturing powerhouse, deeply integrated into European supply chains. By 2019, The Guardian even called it one of Europe's most flourishing economies. Unemployment was among the lowest in the entire EU. The capital, Prague, was booming. Young professionals from across Europe moved there for the quality of life and affordable living. But underneath the surface, problems had been already building up, as is probably always the case with stories too nice to believe in. For nearly a decade before the pandemic, the Czech National Bank kept interest rates near to zero. The idea was simply to stimulate growth. Instead, it actually inflated a massive housing bubble. By 2021, the central bank estimated that property prices were overvalued by 25%. As if this wasn't bad enough, the European Central Bank, on the other hand, put the figure at a staggering 34%. Now, in March 2021 alone, Czechs took out a record 2 billion euros in new mortgages, which was the highest since Czechia's regained independence in 1993. At that point, the rates were actually below 2% on average. People were basically panic buying. The governor of the Czech National Bank later admitted that this was a huge mistake, unsurprisingly. He said that keeping rates essentially at zero, which they were for so long, contributed to the extremely high inflation that we saw in 2022 and 2023. I mean, you don't say, dude. But cheap money was actually only part of the problem. Czechia has actually had a chronic shortage of housing. And the reason is actually staggeringly simple. They simply don't build enough. Getting a building permit in Czechia takes you an average of 247 days, and in some cases, even 10 years or more. That actually means that the country ranks 156th in the world out of a total of 190 countries in the World Bank's Construction Permit Index. And that places Czechia worse than countries like Ethiopia or the Congo. Prague approves roughly 5,000 apartments every single year. But the city actually needs more than 10,000. And over 2 decades, this all created a cumulative deficit of approximately 100,000 apartments that Prague lacks, needs, but simply doesn't have. In August 25 alone, Prague approved just 27 apartments. Yes, in the entire month, for a city of roughly 1.5 million people. And then came COVID, obviously. The pandemic shrank the Czech economy by over 5%. The government responded with generous stimuli, and a controversial tax cut that created a structural deficit still felt today. But the real blow came in February 22, when Russia invaded Ukraine brutally. See, Czechia had actually relied on Russia for 87% of its natural gas. And when the war came, electricity prices actually surged 95%. Gas prices rose over 110%, and when adjusted for purchasing power, Czechs were suddenly paying the highest energy prices in the entire European Union. Inflation, which had hovered around 3% for years, exploded to over 15% in 2022 and peaked at 18% in September 22. Food prices rose by 26%. Bread hit an all-time high. Butter prices jumped 40% in a single year. Real wages fell for 9 consecutive quarters, and Czech workers lost 12 to 13% of their purchasing power during the worst time of the crisis. So basically, every single person in Czechia got poorer. And the consequences of this huge economic downturn are now quite clearly visible in the data. Only 14% of young Czechs can afford a mortgage today. No wonder, just remember the figures from the beginning of the video. 77% of young Czechs fear that they will never actually own a home. And the percentage of under 26 who are still living with their parents jumped from 15 to 23% in a single year. And if you think that the people who managed to get their mortgages in the age of super cheap money are safe, think again, because their fixation period is either expiring really soon or it's already expired, and that means that they're now transitioning from affordable living and super cheap money to financial heart attack because the monthly payments that they have to pay are increasing exponentially. Basically, due to inflation, that refinancing that they need to do is now turning their monthly bills from something manageable into a much meaner payment. And then there's the demographic data, and they are staggering because Czechia's fertility rate actually fell to 1.37 children per woman in 2024, which makes it the lowest since records began in, let's brace for it, 1806. Yes, the lowest number of children is being born since the records began. And to make it all worse, demographers project that this will keep dropping further. 2025 actually saw the fewest births in Czechia ever. Unsurprisingly, 81% of Czechs now say that housing unavailability is the number one obstacle to having children. And I mean, it makes sense when you think about it. The government's response has ranged from inadequate to quite disastrous. Energy price caps cost the state over 5 billion euros, but didn't fix the underlying problems. A new digital building permit system, which was launched in 2024 to great fanfare to finally speed up the construction process, which was so incredibly long, was so dysfunctional when it launched that 43% of businesses actually reported that it caused delays even more than before. And the minister responsible for the system was fired, the system was scrapped, and may not work properly until 2028 and maybe even later. Perhaps the most symbolic moment of this entire disaster came when Prime Minister Fiala posted a video from a German supermarket comparing prices in the German supermarket to Czech stores, and he discovered that Nutella or even Czech beer, the Czech-made Pilsner, was cheaper in Germany. This earned him the nickname Professor Nutella. For struggling families whose number was obviously increasing, this wasn't funny. A prime minister of the sitting government who recommends that you go shop abroad is just disastrous. In October 25, voters delivered their damning verdict of Fiala and his government. The governing coalition lost and Andrej Babiš returned to power. We've also discussed the election recently on Prague Pulse. Do check it out when you're done with this video. See, Czechia's crisis wasn't actually caused by one evil decision. It was a slow-motion car crash of low interest rates, suffocating bureaucracy, and external shocks that no one could have possibly foreseen. A generation that did everything right, they studied, saved up money, and worked, has found that the middle-class life that their parents enjoyed is now a mere luxury that they simply cannot afford. The demographic data suggests that young Czechs have understood the message quite clearly. With the lowest fertility rate since 1806, they're voting with their futures by choosing voluntarily not to have future generations at all. Whether the country's new government of Andrej Babiš can reverse that trajectory will determine whether Czechia remains Europe's cautionary tale or decides to write a different ending. We'll be watching all of this on Prague Pulse, so don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss it in the future. Now, if you found this video informative, please consider also liking this video, and to those already supporting me on hero.co/PraguePulse, thank you so much, because you are the ones making all this possible. I'm Jan, this has been Prague Pulse, and see you very soon.